Hello and welcome to this special crossover episode yet again, where I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, Dr. Eric Helms. Eric, how are you?
I'm well, Mr. Danny Lennon, and it's great to be back on the SNA Iron Sigma Culture Radio podcast news channel. We haven't come up with a good name yet, Alex, but we're trying really hard. I think we've nearly got it. I think what the problem is, we're trying to use too few words, Danny. I think we need more words in the title.
Yeah. To me, I don't know if you guys are fans of The Office, but there's a great little moment in one of the scenes where Michael Scott spells out the headline, and it's like basically a full paragraph of text. I think that's where we're going with this title.
100%. 100%.
So,
I want the title of the podcast to make listening to the podcast optional. I think that's when we know we've hit on gold.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a unique thing. If we have the longest title in podcast history, people are going to say, that's what I want to listen to.
That's right.
We're just doing the Rob McElhenney version of podcast titles.
There you go.
Because all his shows have the longest titles. Always Sunny in Philadelphia. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. What was the Mythic Quest or something? It was super long, and then they changed it down.
Yeah.
Because Apple were like, oh, we have to make it smaller.
Yeah, no, they just went with Mythic Quest. Yeah, it's kind of, slow it down a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, we'll get there.
So with the title out of the way, maybe the rest of this episode will be quite short in comparison, but we're hopefully going to have a good chat that I think will be useful to most of you listening, particularly if you are working in the field of nutrition as a practitioner, whether that's as a nutritionist, dietitian, sports performance nutritionist or dietitian, or in adjacent fields as a fitness professional that gives nutrition advice. We're hopefully going to clarify some things that are often talked about, but maybe have some misconceptions behind that. To do that, we're going to be talking with Alex Thomas of the Sports Nutrition Association. So maybe as a first entry point here, Alex, for people who maybe haven't came across SNA or yourself before, can you give a quick introduction to the Sports Nutrition Association? And I suppose really the mission in many ways of SNA.
Can do. Thanks for the cool intro, Danny. So Sports Nutrition Association is a professional association that was established at the end of 2019 to support the role of sports nutrition practitioners worldwide. And so what that means really is that prior to our inception, pretty much anyone in a global sense, in certain countries and certain regions, there were some associations that were set up that very much handled this. But in a lot of countries across the world, anyone could just call themselves a sports nutritionist. And so they could attend a master's program in sport and exercise nutrition, and there's some phenomenal ones like that. And then they would say, yep, I'm a sports nutritionist, and those people have got great qualifications to be able to do that. But then someone could attend a weekend workshop or watch a 4-hour e-learning course on sports nutrition, and then they would start then referring to themselves as sports nutritionists and providing services. And so our mission is to ensure the sustainable prosperity of the profession. And part of that is establishing standards in the space and then regulating those standards. And then from there, once we're regulating it, then ensuring that everyone involved, both the professionals and the members of the general public alike, have access to safe, sound, evidence-informed information from there.
Just to clarify for people, and this is quite useful because, again, there's a number of these terms that people may have heard, but can sometimes be a bit abstract. So when we're talking about standards that we want to either set or that would ideal for someone to have, what do we really mean by that? Is that simply saying someone needs to have this level of education, or are there more pathways and more ways to thinking about what we mean by the standards that are required for a certain profession?
Great question. It starts with education, like you did mention, but then there's also other things. So professional codes of conduct, experiential minimums as well, really form a big part of these standards. So someone might have the education and an amazing information, but they might really practice in a, like in the shades of gray or in manners that really aren't befitting a professional that's really concerned with looking out for the public or their clientele. And so we're looking at professional codes of conduct. We're looking at experiential minimum standards as well as educational standards. And when I'm saying we are doing that as an association, but we do that in conjunction with the regions and countries in which we operate within the standards that those countries and regions have set as well. And so, for instance, Eric was referencing Spain beforehand. Like in Spain, if you're a personal trainer, you just can't give nutrition advice regardless of the qualifications that you have, unless you're also like a registered dietitian or something like that. Whereas in other countries, for instance, like say New Zealand, you don't necessarily need to have the most robust set of qualifications or even things like registration or insurance to necessarily practice in that space without the country and the governments of the country necessarily caring all that much. It's not to say that they don't care, it's just the degree in which they do care or they would see a problem with that is lower than other countries like your Spains or your Italys or Taiwans, Australia, certain states of the US, for instance.
And within nutrition practice, obviously, we have some professionals that have a protected title when they're a dietitian. And again, in general, I'm talking, and there's going to be some nuances from region to region, but in general, we have this clear protection and scope, and there is significant consequences for someone that claims to be a registered dietitian who is not, and then tries to act in that way. For years, many people have been aware that we haven't had that with nutritionists and nutrition, even in some situations where there is maybe more protections legal-wise in certain regions. There's still, a lot of people don't feel like there's the consequences to maybe acting in these areas where they maybe shouldn't be giving certain types of advice, or maybe it doesn't fit that scope. And so if you are talking to someone who is entering into the field or maybe is a nutrition professional, what are the potential consequences, or why is this stuff important? Why should they be thinking about codes of conduct or having certain standards that they would like to meet, or thinking about things like to what degree they may be insured or not, or whether they should even pursue those things? What are the potential consequences that maybe are sometimes brushed aside?
Okay, so there's a bit to unpack here, but to answer your question immediately, depending on the region you're in, like it could just be as simple as government-based lawsuits where they then like actually take out an action against you, and then they'll impose penalties from there. So depending on the nature of, for lack of a better term, I guess the breaches that they've observed, they'll then impose fines immediately, but they could also have like injunctions to stop you practicing altogether. And that if you do, then you face criminal time and time behind bars. And that might seem like, oh, that's like really full on. That would only happen in a few countries. We've had a case in the last 18 months in Australia that had that, where a personal trainer was posing as a sports nutritionist, a dietitian, and was providing services that were outside of their scope of practice, telling clients to stop taking medication, and then had multiple fines at the tens of thousands of dollars of value, but then also an injunction to stop practicing. And then for every infraction that if he was found to be guilty of from that point, would face up to 1 to 2 years in prison for each infraction from there. So that's like a more recent example. And that's like your worst case scenario. But typically what we're looking at is, and the most common example, because that's like super extreme. And the most extreme ones are the ones that make the headlines, but they're not the common ones. The most common one you will see is there'll be some form of like injury suffered, some form of personal injury. And in nutrition, it's quite it can be quite uncommon for people to understand, or like quite confusing for people to grasp, like what's a nutrition related injury? It could be like something psychological, it could be something medical, it could be something chronic, it could be something acute. But typically something will pop up and then a claim will be made. And typically that's when an insurer will then step in and then cover that injury. It could be a recent example that came to mind was about 18 months ago. Again, there was someone like doing a weight cut, and they were doing a weight cut in a sauna with a sauna suit. And so their nutritionist, their fight nutritionist, had them doing a weight cut in a sauna with a sauna suit, and they got, I think it was first or second degree burns from that. And so then somehow the business partner of the nutritionist, something like that, was like, at this point in time, the fighter wasn't aware that they like were that badly burned. They was like, oh, my skin's really hot. It feels like it's burning and stuff. And so the business partner of the sports nutritionist, something, again, not a member of ours, was like, oh, you should go do cryo. That'll help with healing.
Oh my
and
God.
so what's like one of the worst things to do to a burn is like rapidly cool it. And so the burns then became second and third degree burns to the person. And so that's like an injury that's been suffered as a result of the advice that's been provided. So it's, you know, the service and the advice that they were told to do, they followed it, they then suffered that injury. It could be, you know, like that's pretty extreme again, but typically it's something like that. Refeeding syndrome after a bodybuilding show with hospitalization. So your most common thing is something like that where, you know, they might spend 3-4 days in hospital and they've got the hospital bill, they've got the few days that they can't work, and then they'll put in a claim. And they just want their hospital fees covered or something like that. Then an insurer will typically step in. They'll cover the cost of that. The professional will pay their premium. It might be $500 or $1,000, and then it covers it, and it's all good. And they're typically like the smaller ones. And where we tend to see and observe, I guess, the issues within the industry is that because we're in this like wild west of what you alluded to before, Danny, around the professional titles, like anyone can call themselves a nutritionist. And that's technically true at a first order thinking. But then when you go a few stages down the track, there are certain amounts of duty of care and representation and standards within specific countries that then sort of, while that's technically true, make it more difficult for the person and they expose themselves to greater risk. So that way, in the event where a nutritionist that isn't registered with an association that's defined a clear scope of practice that they endorse them for, that then the insurers then cover them for those activities in, something like this happens where it might just be a $5,000 or a $10,000 personal injury claim, quite quickly becomes exponentially more expensive for the person because they don't have insurance. The client then finds that out and then is like, okay, well, like, what do we do here? And then it's a lawsuit against them personally. And so it's then legal costs are then incurred as a result. And so now that client is then having to take them to court or having to then involve lawyers, and they don't want to have to pay for these legal fees. And so what was $5,000 or $10,000 becomes $40,000 to $50,000 quite quickly.
I think it's really interesting how much this can differ by region. So for American listeners, they're relatively comfortable with the idea of there being legal criminal consequences or civil consequences. And then on a state-by-state basis, laws can differ, and there may or may not be more of a quote-unquote watchdog environment. And that those kind of differences can also occur in different countries. So in many, many of the U.S. states, there's no watchdog agency that is going to be watching out for someone to say, hey, I am a nutritionist and that's not okay. Or you're offering advice that only should be for registered dietitians. And there's only going to be a response in reality if the actual dietitians point out, hey, you're breaching scope of practice. And then it could potentially be a government driven attempt to say, hey, you're breaching a law that actually protects this scope of practice for a dietitian. But in most cases, that's simply not going to happen, and it hasn't really happened in the States. But I
don't think it'll happen in many countries, to be honest. I think what you're talking about is probably the average. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. And there's only a few countries where there's actually like a watchdog agency attached to the government. So what is more likely to happen is that there is going to be some incident that occurs, rightly or wrongly ascribed to a nutritionist's negligence, and then that is going to turn into, like you said, litigation, right? So I think what we're really talking about here, and this might be a concept more familiar to people, is a personal trainer getting personal trainer's insurance. And what is it like to actually work at a facility where you're covered? There are layers of protection that personal trainers typically get. A lot of the times in the US, for example, in kind of a market-regulated system for personal trainers, your gym will not hire you unless you have certain certifications. Why does the gym not want to hire you if you don't have those personal certifications? For two reasons. One, they actually want to make sure you do have some competency in your job. So they're going to look at an NSCA, an ACSM, an ACE, a NASM, all those, et cetera, because those are been more recognized. They're sometimes attached to actual journal publications and have, bodies that have existed for a while. And also they have an insurance underwriter. And that may not make any sense to you. Like, okay, so I get insurance, like whatever. But I think you have to understand, what does that actually mean? And what that's saying is that a company is happy with the level of risk that there is in you practicing, and they think it's actually a financially good decision for them to provide you insurance. And technically, an insurance company does not want claims. So they're basically saying, I think you're competent enough to reduce the risk to the point where we're making money off you paying your monthly insurance bill, because I don't think you're going to actually have to hit us up and be like, yeah, so I killed this dude in a weight cut. Can you please, pay them off, that type of thing.
Yeah.
So not only do you carry your personal insurance as a personal trainer, that you can typically only get a high quality insurance coverage from having a quote unquote high quality personal trainer certification, but the gym won't hire you and you won't be covered under their insurance because everyone is trying to mitigate their own financial risk. But that financial risk is representative of these specific companies, be it the gym or be it that insurance company. It's basically looking at you and saying, do I think this person is a risk to clients to the point where that insurance will hurt our bottom line? So I think that is something that sometimes, especially young personal trainers, don't really realize what that actually means. They just were trying to get a piece of paper. They're supposed to do this, or I don't need to worry about that. Why would someone sue me? But essentially, by being able to show that you are insured, you are also showing that you have done certain things that are convincing big companies who care about their bottom line that you are unlikely to actually have these issues that you are insured for. So that is the nature of insurance, and I don't think people get that. And in the nutrition space, yeah, there's a lot of potential for harm. I mean, nutritionists are often doing things like telling people, well, bad nutritionists, I should say, are doing things like telling people that the dietary choices they have might be able to cure or prevent disease. They might be telling them, and especially in sports nutrition, I think the most common risk is things like weight cuts. Back in the 90s, people might not know this, the whole reason why collegiate wrestling went to a shorter weigh-in period was because of the longer weigh-in period where there was more time to rehydrate. Wrestlers were cutting more weight to make a lower weight class, and there was actually a number of collegiate wrestlers in 1998 who died. So that's the type of thing that does and can happen in certain scenarios, especially weight class restricted sport, especially physique sport, and more often now we're destigmatizing mental health. So things like eating disorders, things like body image concerns that can come up and actually be diagnosed and treated, that can count as something that is a true clinical issue that you could be sued for. And not having the training for something like a eating disorder, and then moving forward and working with someone who has reported that, you are opening yourself up to a lot of risk. And there are examples in the States and other countries where things like that do happen, where they go, look, actually, you didn't just step on the scope of practice of a dietitian, but a psychotherapist. So I think that nuance is often missed because I just don't think most professionals like to think about things like insurance. And I think government registration is easy. Like, oh, dietitians, they can do this, and the government has a law, and they say if you say you can do that or you call yourself that and you're not, you can actually suffer criminal charges. That's very clear cut. But I think in a personal litigation, industry regulated scenario, it is sometimes just too confusing, too opaque, and simply just not something that people are interested in or passionate about. And it gets lost what these things actually mean and what they signal and the type of risk that you're actually exposed to.
Yeah, that was great. I think there's an analogy that I like to use with this to just help people understand. And it's really just like relating it to your car insurance, right? Like how often do you get into a car accident if you're driving? If you're not in those like crazy roundabouts in India and stuff, like maybe it's a bit more frequent. But that represents the environment in which you're operating, where the risk is. So it's like if you're in a car and you're driving, what's the likelihood that you get injured? And then in the that you get in an accident, sorry. And then in the event that you do get in an accident, what's the ratio of fault? Is it like them at fault or you at fault? It doesn't really matter. As soon as something happens, that's when you need your insurance. And so it's one of these things where that's exactly what it's like in nutrition as a professional. There's just a few things we sort of need to look out for with it. And like the real quick list is like every policy has what's called a duty of disclosure. And so there's typically like 3 areas that you'll be signing off on to say, hey, I am appropriately qualified for the things that I'm doing. And then the second thing is I'm appropriately registered for the things that I'm doing. And then the third thing is, and of that registration, the scope of practice nominated by that association or body that I'm registered with matches that I'm doing. And these are like the get out of jail free cards that the insurers have to then not cover you in the event of your service-based car accident.
I think that is actually a really key point right there. Insurance companies do not want to give you the insurance money. And the first thing that the insurance claimer is going to do is look to see how you violated the agreement that you made. Because essentially what's happening is they go, okay, I have made a connection with insert X personal training certification, associative body, sports. We'll just say the SNA. Hey, I am saying I have an agreement with the SNA that for their members, if they do these things and they practice within this scope, sure, I will cover them for nutrition negligence. And what that means is I will pay you money. I will lose money out of my company coffers if you call upon and make an insurance claim with this insurance company. So the first thing they're going to do is, all right, did this guy step outside of the scope of practice? Okay, damn it, no, he didn't. I guess we still got to pay him. Well, hold on. Did he stay up with his continuing education? Damn it, looks like he did. Okay, I guess I got to pay him. So that checklist is what they're going to be going through. So that is essentially kind of what we're talking about here. The insurance, like you said, having the insurance isn't the get out of jail card. It's doing the things that shows you are compliant with your insurance when you're, in a bad way. And I think that's another level that clarifies why it's not just a piece of paper or a PDF in 2024 that is covering you. So no, that's really good context. But I want to go back to something Danny asked about and bring this up. I think scope of practice is something that is sometimes maybe just brushed off as legalese or these very specific kind of guidelines. And I feel like there's not a full respect of what they actually mean and why there are laws and regulations around them in the first place. Like what led to that outcome? And why did we even need scope of practice in the first place? And also, I think there is a conversation to be had here, Danny, about what do you do when you start to bump up against the edge of your scope of practice? Because I think a lot of maybe more risk-averse trainers and nutritionists, they get in a position where they might think they're brushing up against the edge of their scope of practice. And you might have two people who make very different decisions in those scenarios because they are operating out of a sense of fear rather than a sense of confidence in knowing what they mean, what they can do, and who potentially should be in their network of support people.
Yeah. I mean, just to add one thing on that, because it is such an important point, and on actually one of the recent episodes that our other board members, Eric Trexler and Gab Fundaro, talked about aspects of this, particularly in relation to some of the issues around, say body image, where you have this area that is starting to get into this gray zone, like you mentioned, Eric. And you can go on one end, you could have that complete risk-averse person that says anything that is veering towards there, it's always the solution is I'm just going to refer someone out. But the problem is you have many cases where you can't refer someone out because there's not a clinical threshold being met for someone to be able to avail of psychological services, as an example. And so then your solution is what? Just you're not going to work with that person and let them go off to the next personal trainer or nutritionist that will claim to help them. So you have this ethical dilemma there. Plus, there's plenty of things you can probably do within a scope of practice, but it's being clear on what that is. And I think, I suppose, this is where the connection comes from, just simply having the insurance, like you mentioned, but also having that backed up with, if you are a member of an organization that can help you keep up to date with your education, that can give you guidance on what that scope is, where you're overstepping that or have the resources to do that. Then there are those cases where someone can go into the situations with a bit more confidence because they're very clear on where that line is, and they can work right up to that as long as they are competent to do so and feel comfortable with doing it, of course, and then are very clear on, okay, what certain actions are going to trigger a referral and to who. Because, yeah, there's plenty of situations that you said that go just beyond that limit, right? If you're going to work with combat sport athletes, there's no point in saying, I can tell you just about your general dietary pattern throughout your training camp, but when it comes to cutting weight and dehydration, I'm not a physiologist, so I'm not going to talk about any of that. Good. But you're now in this kind of gray zone. So being aware, well, what am I covered to do? What can I do? What do I have the competence to do? What is likely to hurt that person is where some of this starts to come in. So yeah, I think that's a great point. I'd love for you to maybe elaborate a bit on that, Alex, of what Eric has raised here, of those situations of not only knowing scope of practice, but we're in a field, particularly with nutrition, that can be broad enough certain times where you have this gray zone. And oftentimes it's not suitable to say, well, everyone just we're going to just reject anything that is veering towards something that's really clean cut. What type of advice could we give to professionals in that area?
So the first thing I'd start with is like go on to any association that you're a member of and physically get the scope of practice that's defined. Because so many people, and like myself included, before I even started with SNA, I was just toiling around in university thinking I was a glorified personal trainer. I was like, cool, I've done some nutrition subjects, so I'm going to be able to work with clients' nutrition. And so because I just made this association that I had studied it, therefore I could do it, like in the real world. And it wasn't until my broker told me, he was like, the only person who's covered here is the dietitian that comes in once a week, like you and all your friends. My friends being graduates of exercise and nutrition science programs, so like they've, nutrition science degrees. He's like, yeah, they can't do it. And here I was as the head of a company being like, well, this sucks. I'm, even though it's a limited liability company, I'm the director, so it's my neck on the chopping block. But we got to find a way to fix this. But that was my first really big lesson in the space, was like, okay, it's not what you've studied. What you have studied is not your scope of practice. What your scope of practice is what is written in the scope of practice document in the association that is endorsing you to do these things with the public. And that was a really big learn for me. Hence why everything started with what became Sports Nutrition Australia, and then the association was like, we need to have a clearly defined scope of practice for professionals in the space. So that way we can do the things that we want to do, which is like help people improve their performance, improve their body composition, manage their weight, all these things that are like non-medical nutrition therapy, but still have a massive need with the general public and populace. And in my opinion, are like the more fun parts of nutrition. Now, someone who's a dietitian and a clinical nutritionist, they're probably going to be sitting here going, that's so boring. It's so repetitive. We love the medical nutrition therapy. I love being Dr. House with people's food. Like, it's the best thing. But to me, that was it. So that's the first thing. The next thing, like once you're clear on it, then it's like talking with the members of the association that work in the space to work out where the fringe lines and margins are within the scope of practice. Because you're never going to know. Like, I was talking to you guys about this before we started recording, and how we're doing a recruitment drive at the moment for a particular position within the association to really help with the members. And some candidates have applied, and if they have degrees in the background, great. In the field, degrees and backgrounds in the field, that's great. But if not, it's not the end of the world. A number of people have degrees. Of the people that have degrees, some of these have been in the industry for over a decade, members of associations, involved with these associations, and they're saying to me like, yeah, well, like, what's the story with scope of practice? Like what, are you familiar with mine? Like, with this association? And like what's the difference between that and yours? And I would say that's a sentiment shared by, what do you guys reckon? Like 90% of the industry? Like, unless you're someone like myself doing this as your day-to-day job, or like you guys, like like working with an organization that is really trying to establish a clear scope of practice and standard within the industry, like I don't think many people would be really clear on what their scope is and then where the fringe margins are.
Yeah, I think there's a fair number of people who do understand what their scope of practice might be because they read it in, say, their personal trainer manual or their sports nutrition add-on certification, but they don't know what it means to have that scope. Because in many cases, you have your membership to a professional association. You know, you're a member of the NSCA, right? Because you're an NSCA CPT or an NSCA CSCS, right? And then the next step is you go out and you get your personal trainer or your whatever insurance. And I think the issue here is that nobody reads it. They just figure out what insurance coverage can I get? What do all my buddies get? What does my mentor get? And guess what? They probably didn't read it either. So they're not actually thinking about what they can do. They're just thinking, I need to tick the box of worst case scenario, have insurance. Kind of like I'm not legally allowed to drive in the US unless I have insurance, and I can be arrested by not carrying insurance. Similar mindset. I just need to have this. Not going, oh, I actually need to read my insurance policy because it specifically tells me what I can do and still be able to claim my insurance. Because again, they're going to be looking at it and going, how do I not pay your dumbass, right? So yeah. I think that perspective is just missing that last link as to what does the scope of practice mean? And then because there is legal risk, sometimes people, like Danny was saying, they take it too far the other direction. Like you get people who either don't read it or they're super risk adverse, they do read it, and then it's just like immediately hands off. And I think, you know, like when you went to your broker, when you were running your gym, or your gym was you and your buddies who were all, you know, graduates of an exercise science and nutrition program who found out you didn't actually have coverage to provide nutrition advice. You're like, only the dietitian is once a week. Then you go, okay, hold on. So in what way can we have this covered by the dietitian or the psychotherapist or the whatever? And it's a really common thing that you'll see in the States or many countries actually, where there will be a doctor or there will be a physical therapist or there will be a physio or there will be a registered dietitian who comes in and has the insurance scope that is needed to do certain consultations, but importantly, in collaboration with the rest of the team, right? So that plan has been enacted by, I didn't give it to you. You sat down for 20 minutes after you sat with me in my personal training chair. You went and sat with the SNA, you know, nutritionist chair. He said, here's what you're going to do. And he gives that to me. And I'm the one kind of carrying it out. But as far as you're concerned, they gave you that and their insurance covers it. And the business and the organization on the back end is structured in such a way that that is actually the way it's done. So for example, all of our nutrition plans that we give out at 3D Muscle Journey online, Steve Taylor, our registered dietitian, looks them over. And it's not just a box ticking exercise either. Sometimes he catches things because he's a registered dietitian that the four of us or the five of us are not necessarily totally clued in on or would have missed, or he has input that's useful. And then he's committed to saying, yep, I am signing off on this and I am approving this, and essentially saying, this is a registered dietitian who is giving you this guidance, you know? So that type of structure is pretty common in different countries or different situations for those protections because that person has that ability to give that scope. So when, you know, the fit hits the shan and something does come up, you can go, hold on, that is within the scope of our dietitian. They looked it over, they approved it, and they have that coverage and a legal protection to do so. And I just don't think that's thought through. And like I said, like Danny mentioned, sometimes you're in an ethical dilemma where you've got someone and maybe they do have actually, you know, let's not go with the gray zone of they have a disordered eating pattern, but they wouldn't actually meet the criteria for, say, binge eating disorder, and therefore they can't, you know, get that help. If you have people in your referral network, and if you're a part of an association that actually does its job well, they're going to help you find a network and mentors and people who can work with you. And you can say, you know what, maybe you don't have binge eating disorder. Maybe you can't go claim insurance and go see through your primary care and get a referral to see your therapist. But you could actually maybe spends half the money with me, and we change our coaching structure so it doesn't take as much work on my end. But since you need help that's outside of my scope, I work in conjunction on certain things through the private kind of pay pathway, this therapist who's helping you within their scope of practice, even though you don't have a clinically defined term, and to give you some guidance and to give me some guidance so that I can keep helping you. And I think that is probably the best approach to take. I don't think anyone should be operating in the nutrition space, and arguably even as a personal trainer, just given anyone who's been a PT knows you end up being their therapist, their step cousin, or you essentially become their everything. You're at least the first port of call. Like, hey, my elbow hurts. What should I do? So anyway, you find out about their divorce. You find out about everything, right? So it's so easy to venture into the land of therapy. It's so easy to venture into the land of physical therapy. It's so easy to venture into the land of even medical advice or nutrition. So if you're going to become a personal trainer or a nutritionist especially, you need to essentially have a network that includes a doctor, a physical therapist, a nutritionist, and a psychotherapist who all have expertise in the realm of fitness, nutrition, et cetera. And then it's not just a person to dump your scary clients on. It's someone to work in collaboration with. And I think when you talk to them and they understand that, it's mutually beneficial. And those models are really common in the industry. And I think they're more common among people who understand the risk, but not just the risk, the benefit of having that in your corner, because it enables you to keep working with people who really need your help and who are the most common victims to the charlatans in our industry. And it gives you a pathway forward rather than you just kind of clinging to your scope of practice and the bylaws of your association and your insurance policy like, kind of a blanket that you're holding over your head because you're scared.
But I mean, particularly as you were saying that, some of the things that come to mind is, given that many people are, as you mentioned, Eric, aware of generally what their scope of practice is, or maybe oftentimes operate within that. Sometimes the risk comes up when there's these smaller things that they don't even really think as part of their main nutrition service, like these offshoot services, which are now more of a pressure for professionals to include, whether that's someone coming to them with supplements that they can offer their clients, as an example, or diagnostics now is a huge thing. Oh, if you can offer certain testing for these things, right? You can get blood tests or whatever type of test for someone. And there's some people that clearly are in this realm of operating with more, let's say, an alternative medicine spin on that, which is one thing in itself. But even then, there are diagnostic tests that are legitimate, but maybe can be used and misinterpreted or misused by someone who doesn't have proper medical expertise. But there's now a pressure because some of these things are available to consumers now and people are using that as part of their practice. So that ends up being this other layer where we're much less likely to even think about that when we're considering our scope of practice or insurance, because it only plays a tiny, at least initially, a tiny part of someone's overall service. But these are the things that are likely to maybe trip someone up at some point. And maybe one of the things that I'd like to get your thoughts on, Alex, as well, some of those things that you've started to see change within the industry, or certainly going forward, if we think of the next number of years ahead, some of the types of trends that have started to become part of what people may see offered by a nutritionist on social media or online or in whatever situation that become quite popular, but that may be, again, fit into this conversation around understanding that scope. Where does that lie? And what things people need to, as a competent professional, maybe what they should be on the lookout for.
So, I mean, you touched on it before. Bloods is like a massive one. It's very trendy. It's, unless you're a doctor or like a specialized type of dietitian, and you're a nutrition professional, don't touch bloods. Even if you've done a course on it, don't touch it. It'll be out of your scope. And for good reason. Like a 2-day course or a 4-week course is just not going to replace 8 to 10 years of medicine. An interesting one, I don't know if you guys are aware of it, but the board of directors recently with 23andMe all resigned.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and so that's one of the other more trendy ones recently, is the personalized genetic-based nutrition. again, it's very much on the fringes of like dietetics and personalized medicine and stuff, where a lot of the advice that's being given, it's starting to cross the line into like medicine. Sorry, Eric, you're gonna.
No, I just want to clarify.
Well.
So the board of directors of 23andMe resigned because they didn't think that there should be personalized medical advice, or what was?
No. I think
were they forced to resign, or
they recently resigned. I think there was a data breach with like personalized information, but I think there was that's what they've disclosed thus far. But I think there's a few other things to it as well. Like typically, if the whole board resigns, or a number of key board members resign, then I mean, I don't want to say, I don't know. I'm not going to say anything. But I mean, the genetics and personalization, there was the, I forget her name, with the blood tests, you know, the small little blood test machines and stuff. There were those things. So typically when you're seeing that type of stuff, you can't help but question based on history, like what's going on with the financials as well. But yeah, I think there's been a lot of big claims made in the way of personalized health and genetic-based interventions for the very low cost, easy access, low barrier to entry things that you can do, or, you know, measure your wrist and I'm going to tell you exactly what your hormone levels are at, or like what your body's somatotype-based hormones are like, that type of stuff. There's really, and I'm sure you guys know, like Danny, you interview the best people in the world in this space. So like, you're probably better confirming it, but like there's some phenomenal genetic testing that can be done in medicine, and provide some amazing insights into medical intervention, but typically it's not saliva swabs or, you know, wrist measurements. They're pretty costly and pretty involved, and you've got to be working with some pretty senior specialists to get to that point. Is what's often sort of there. So there's that, I would say, in the general nutrition space. And then in sports, we're seeing like definitely supplements is a big one. You know, try this new supplement. It's amazing. It's going to shave half a kilo off your weight loss, you know, in the next 2 weeks. And then it's got albuterol or something in it. And it wasn't what they were saying. It wasn't the African form of Garcinia cambogia from the rarest part of the jungle in Africa or something like that. It's just got like albuterol or, you know, full trace amounts of DNP or something in it. And it was just all marketing. So supplements is definitely a big one to be wary of. Within the association, that's why we say like HASTA certified, informed sport, like, and then even for our openly accredited members, if they're working with semi-pro and professional athletes, we don't require, but we strongly recommend that they go and do an anti-doping certification as well. And then they maintain that just to stay across it if they're working with those types of athletes. Just so that way they're plugged into the information, and they're constantly aware of it. Because imagine having like a semi-professional amateur on the cusp of becoming pro or on the cusp of becoming like a world champion, and then they have this tainted supplement and it gets them banned for the next 4 years. And the Olympics was, say, the following year or something like that, and they were on form to have a red hot crack at that gold. Like, I couldn't think of anything worse.
And you're the one who recommended it to them because, yeah.
Or they came to you and they said, I want to try this, and you just didn't say no firmly enough. Because it's not those things. You're like, oh, it should be okay, be careful, something like that, instead of like, no, it's not HASTA, it's not informed sport. Like, it has to be independently batch tested. You just have to do that. Like, if we're going for a gold, let's not leave anything to chance. James Clear in Atomic Habits talks about the aggregate of marginal gains. Like, what about the aggregate of marginal losses? You know, if you're dealing with world champion athletes, like, the inversion is also true. Let's try and limit those things, especially if we're talking about like doping bans.
I would say it's even more true because, you know, an interesting thing, and I can say, and I know, Danny, you've worked with some pretty high level athletes as well, is when someone comes to you, they don't necessarily know what you can give them. And in the space of nutrition, there's the most opportunity to help someone when they're doing some batshit crazy stuff. like they've been on some really wild diets, or they've got really low-hanging fruit that they are, or the lack of low-hanging fruit, to mix metaphors and have the pun be intended. So when someone is like, yeah, I just don't consume protein, or yeah, I just don't consume plants, because of the current competing, vegan versus carnivore space, or I don't eat any carbs. Yes, I'm an 800-meter runner, or whatever, like there's these opportunities that you get with nutrition, like, oh, I just don't know how to make weight, right? Or I bonk at these times, or I'm chronically underhydrated, or I just don't understand anything about nutrition. You can make these really big leaps and bounds, but when someone comes to you who is doing okay on that front, you know that you have a limited scope to help them. So the appropriate perspective is to be relatively risk averse, because the person's already at a high level. When someone comes to me who is going, yeah, I'm just trying to move up the podium. I'm like, all right, well, they're doing enough sufficiently right now to be a podium winner at IPF Worlds. So I can't throw out the entire, kitchen sink that they've been using. There's probably some gems in there, unless I just think they're that much of a genetic phenom. But you will really find that with high-level coaches, they are always doing this calculus of what is the potential risk of me changing something. And especially with those types of things, you need to be incredibly risk-averse, because when you do something in elite level sport that egregious, like you recommend accidentally an athlete take something that got them banned, or your athlete, there's a lot of potential negative outcomes. Like elite level athletes typically in a given sport work with people who other elite level athletes work with and recommended them. And the stigma that you can get if you mess up an elite level athlete, there's a reason why the first person to get shit canned in these high performance sporting environments are the S&Cs and the nutritionists, is because they're kind of seen as ancillary. It's an easy person to pass the buck to. And it is something where it's like a small potential marginal gain, but a high risk of messing things up if you do some wacky stuff. So I think that's a really good perspective to have, is that you need to know the limits of what you can do positively, but also the potential harm from you being either too passive in that example you gave, or just outright negligent, which I think is less of a concern when we're talking to people who are even thinking about the stuff that we're talking about, but nonetheless is the reason why our association even exists.
And then the final point I'd say, and this is just a bit of a novel thing that I've seen recently, is the attempt to normalize the loss of menstruation for like female weight loss, whether it's like a physique competition or just like, oh, they're getting really lean for this event or something like that. But like it is a thing and it is a phenomenon and it can occur, but we shouldn't try and normalize it to the point where it's like, it's going to happen and it's okay that it happens. And that's one of the areas that I would see with professionals at the moment that I would like caution them on, like err on the side of caution. Please don't try and normalize it further. You shouldn't stigmatize it to the point where the client feels really bad for it happening. Like it can happen, but it shouldn't be a thing that it's like that should be celebrated if it does.
Alex, I think a good parallel for that one specifically. I think it's most needed to talk about this in physique sport, because the odds are that a physique sport athlete who does well, unfortunately, is probably going to lose her menstrual cycle at some point for some amount of time, or at least experience oligomenorrhea. Now, there of course are exceptions to that. Leaner category, just more robust person, able to maintain a higher energy availability, relatively low body fat set point, all that good stuff, or I should say lower intervention point. But I think it's akin to saying, okay, I have a American football player, or I have a fighter, a striking fighter, right? TBIs happen. A concussion, it happens, like whatever. We're not going to worry about it. We're not going to screen for it. We're not going to do anything about it when it happens. It's just, hey, you got your bell rung, go back in there. Well, we kind of did that for 20 years. And now we had some pretty severe cases and a huge controversy in the NFL and even in rugby and some other countries. We know that if you play certain positions in contact sport, it is a question of when, not if, for most athletes. but we don't take it lightly. It's not like we don't try to prevent it or do concussion research or put accelerometers in helmets or things like that. And much like we're not trying to do research on, and I'm part of this, what's the fastest way to recover one's menstrual cycle? What's the way to mitigate the amount of harm that's done, the length of time spent in that situation, and how do we keep energy availability as high as possible for as long as possible while still meeting the demands of the sport? Not just, well, it's going to happen anyway, so F it, let's just put her on an 800-calorie diet. I think that's the risk that we certainly want to avoid. It needs to be respected, even though it is something that is going to happen. Like in NASCAR, you don't go, well, you're going to crash. Like, well, yeah, give me a seatbelt and the roll bar, for Christ's sake. Like, don't just, they'd be like, hey, you burned up, it happens. That's I think there's an important distinction to be made there, even when something has a high prevalence rate, that something is still done about it, and you do what you can in that context. Because I think sometimes I've interfaced with dietitians who are not really aware of the realities of physique sport, and they have a firm line of you have to prevent the occurrence of REDs in all cases. And I can tell you for 9 out of 10 female competitors, especially in leaner divisions, preventing REDs is also preventing success. But that doesn't mean we don't try to mitigate the negative effects. And there is such a thing, if we look at the 2023 update, as functional low energy availability, right? So longer, competition time course, et cetera. I'm going on a tangent, but I think people get my point. And those types of distinctions are the reason why continuing education is important. The scope of practice is important, and that professional organizations are important, and who are exposing themselves to risks to make sure that you are actually staying up to date. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox.
No, I think that's an incredibly important point, and I think it speaks to many of the things we've tried to raise. So maybe if we end on this, Alex, because as Eric mentioned earlier, this topic can be, while incredibly important, can be quite boring to many professionals because it has nothing to do with training, fitness, nutrition. It's a side thing that we kind of have to maybe tick some of the boxes on, but that can often leave people at risk for a number of things, not only insurance and legal wise, but also for their actual competency as a professional, because they're missing out on all these things and interacting with others in an organization that can really help their career. So maybe to round this out, we can refresh people on some of those terms and really probably what is the best way for them to think about being a competent sports nutritionist professional going forward, and what that really means in terms of for those people who don't want to go and read through huge piles of documents around insurance, or really find all this stuff maybe a bit confusing. What is the first few checkpoints you would say for someone who wants to make sure they're working within their scope, doing it ethically, but doing it competently? And what is the, I suppose, best framework for them as a professional going forward to ensure they continue to do those things? If that's not too much of a broad, open question, but if there are some thoughts that come to mind that would round out everything we've said that might relate to that question.
So this is going to be a little bit long, but I just want to echo what you said, in that this is pretty boring, and this is the stuff you don't want to think about. And even in saying this, the majority of the episode has centered on it. I would say it's the thing that you should spend 1 or 2 days a year just satisfying. That's it. Outside of that, there's more important things. There's the things that you enjoy that you were talking about, right? It's like what are the fun things in my profession that I enjoy? And then I think between scope and registration and insurance and the things that you enjoy, there's the things that you need to focus on to be a successful nutrition professional that are actually far more important than this anyway. And so to me, that is to steal Eric's pyramids. It asked me for my pronoun, and I said the third creator of the pyramids, or the creator of the third book. If I were to say, what are the pyramids of a nutrition professional? I would say their ability to communicate and connect with people is the foundation. You have to. You're in a professional service. You have to connect with people. Within that is your ability to sell. You have to sell yourself. You have to sell your plans. You have to do those types of things. And the next layer above that is really how you invest and what you do with your money. And if you can just do those two things really well while still doing the things that you're enjoying in the field, then you're going to stay in the profession for the next 10, 15, 20 years. And the people that we need in the industry long term, helping the rest of the population, are then still going to be in the field, working on the front lines and helping people. And that's what we need. So if you can master those two things while still focusing on all the areas that you love, that's it. And when I say invest because the reality is like, unless you're one of the outliers, like unless you're a Jeremy Ether or someone like that, Jeff Nippard, you're not going to be a gazillionaire in this space. But that's cool. Like if you're in this space, chances are you are not doing it to be a gazillionaire. You're doing it so that you can help people. And so I say that so you can take money off the table and you don't have to think about it. And so that way you can then just focus on helping people. And so the reason I say invest is like you probably, if you look at like, for instance, the S&P 500, right? They're better at business than what the average nutritionist or personal trainer is. So just pop it there, whack it in index funds, invest, pay your house off, whatever it is, put your tax away. Develop a level of basic financial literacy so you can just focus on doing what it is that you do. And then, you know, like the supplements in the nutrition part of the pyramid, that's your insurance and registration. That's the smallest part. And so to your question, Danny, like now that we've covered, I guess, the hierarchy of where to focus, like what can they do? If you're in a region or a country that you have an established organization for sports nutrition, then go and register with them. Like it doesn't have to be with us. Like in the UK, there's CENA, Sport Exercise Nutrition Registry. That's it. Like they're a great organization. They're a part of the BDA. You can go and register with them. There's just not a lot of organizations like CENA in like countries throughout the world. So that's where SNA comes in and we go, cool, we actually have a globally approved policy. And the cool thing about us is that once you're a member in one country, you recognize in all of the others, and the insurance policies that we have take care of that. And so if you don't want to read the stuff, that's cool. We'll do it for you. We'll keep you updated. All you got to do is just read the odd email from us. We try to send the things that are important at least 2 or 3 times to remind you. And then I would still recommend like reading it. Like don't just trust us to do it, but you can have some faith in us that we're going to operate in your best interest and keep you abreast of things. But it would be get some form of registration with an association, and then you'll be good to go. The other thing would be keep an eye out for, and this is a bit of a trap because a lot more short courses are popping up where they're like 2 months in length, and they might be like the equivalent of a level 3 or a level 4 qualification. So like a certificate 3 or 4. In most countries, regions, that's not going to be sufficient to operate as a nutritionist. And that's something to keep a lookout for. And so these places will say, well, technically nutritionist isn't a protected title. And that's true. But there's the second and third order effects that you need to be considerate of. And that is that whilst it may not be a protected title, most countries or insurers, even at least, they're going to say, hey, we want like bachelor's, grad certs, grad dips as a minimum, like these programs that require at least grad cert. If we're talking grad cert, it's like 6 months. Bachelor's, we're looking at 2 to 3 years, depending on if you're doing semesters or trimesters and stuff. Grad dips, typically it'll be grad cert to grad dip. That might be 2 years, 2 to 3 years. They want that as a minimum before you're fully out and fully fledged doing what you should be doing in order to cover you. And so these other smaller ones, they sort of say, hey, you don't have, like there's no protection in the title, so you don't have to worry about that. Yes, you can from this level 3 or 4. And the issue that you run into is that while that's true, insurers aren't going to cover you, and then the countries might have standards with that as well. And so you open yourself up for what's like known as misleading and deceptive conduct. So if you represent yourself as a nutritionist, and then there is like a well-known standard of these things, or other associations in the countries and regions in which you're operating are adhering to these things, and the insurers are as well, there's that other thing as well that sort of comes up. So it's just one other thing to look out for. But again, like this is the supplements. Like find the stuff that you love, your passion. That's the underlying thing. Like if we're talking about Eric's pyramids on nutrition, behavior, and lifestyle is the thing that sits underneath it. Then the next thing is communication. That's like your total energy balance. Like it's communication. You really need to communicate and connect. The thing above that with macros and stuff is like take money off the table and get financially like sound and a basic thing. And then you're going to be a practitioner for the next 5, 10, 15 years. And you can then work from a place of choice. Like, hey, I love working with my clients. I don't have to. And that would be my goal for like any aspiring nutrition professional, regardless of if it's sports nutrition or not.
Alex, I like it. And it's funny. I think there's an important distinction between your pyramid, which it sounds like is communication. It's like basically the career nutritionist, nutrition pyramid, right?
Yeah.
There's an important distinction because communication, investing in yourself financially, and just taking a couple days a year so that you're, paying attention and staying protected and aware of the changing nature of your scope of practice and your potential changing nature of your insurance policy and where you can cover and all that stuff, is that, yeah, it only takes a couple days per year. But if you ignore it, it can cause a really big issue. If you ignore supplements, you'll never know. You will just feel duped, like, oh, I'm missing out on something because of the sexy marketing. But if you spent an entire bodybuilding career not taking creatine and you compared it to an alternate reality where you took creatine, I'm not actually sure you would have placed higher. You know what I'm saying? But if you go through an entire nutrition career, like 30, 40 years long of working with people and all the kinds of people that are out there and all the unique personalities and circumstances that may or may not be negligence that falls upon your doorstep, but could be attributed to you, and you have not paid attention to what your actual scope of practice is, and you've done something as innocent as, I didn't ask for their blood work, but they gave it to me. And I said, oh, I'm a little concerned about X. And they interpreted that as, oh, I should get a supplement to deal with that. And then that ended up being a problem. And they come at you. Well, that little tiny piece of the pyramid, when you didn't address it, that could be like $1 million lawsuit in certain countries. So yeah, I think it's the kind of thing where technically, from a time investment perspective and a likelihood and probability perspective, small part of the pyramid, but the potential risk is much higher than not taking supplements. And I think that's just an important thing to point out.
Thanks for the spot.
So with that, yeah, I think that does us for this conversation. So thank you both. I've really enjoyed chatting.
My pleasure,
Thanks
Danny.
for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode. Hopefully you found it useful. If anything that you wanted to check or learn more about any of these topics or hear more from the SNA, of course, that'll be available in the description box wherever you're currently listening now if you want to check any of that out or find out more. And of course, if you wish to continue to listen to either myself or Dr. Helms, check out Iron Culture Podcast or Sigma Nutrition Radio. But with that, thank you everyone for listening. Hope you've enjoyed, and we'll talk to you again in the future.